welcome to Silversmithing with Chad. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the safety issues you have to deal with when you're becoming a silversmith. Chiefly amongst them, I'd like to talk about some of the chemicals that we use, some of the tools and how to use them safely, and then also just how to be situationally aware so that you don't catch your shop on fire. Okay, one of the things that you use when you're silversmithing, and it's a really important part of silversmithing because when you're working on silver it gets looking pretty messed up and nasty, and so you need something to clean it up after you're done, and the substance that I use for that is called Pickle Safe, and it's a dilute form of sulfuric acid which you mix up yourself. It comes as a white granular powder. I use this particular one called Rio Pickle that I get from Rio Grande, and I generally mix it up a little more dilute than they suggest because it doesn't really need to be as strong as they say to still be workable, and it's a good pickle that really cleans things up well, so I like it a lot. One of the things you have to know about pickle is that being as it is sulfuric acid, you still want to be a little careful with it, even though it's not as strong as some sulfuric acids like your car battery acid. As long as you're careful, I try not to get it on my clothes because sometimes after you launder your clothes you might end up with a hole or two. The things you need to remember about Rio Pickle and Pickle Safe in general is that it is sulfuric acid, and so you have to be a little careful around it. You want to make sure you don't get it in your eyes or your mouth. If it gets on your skin, it has a tendency to dry out your skin a little bit, and it's not really that big of a deal. Your hands generally get trashed in this hobby anyway, so you kind of got to get used to that and just use a lot of lotion and things like that. And I suggest washing your hands periodically when you're using this stuff, just to make sure you don't leave it sitting on your skin for too long. One of the other chemicals that we use is Flux, and we use that to prepare the metal for soldering. And what it does is it cleans the oxides off the surface of the metal and then creates a coating which prevents the oxides from reforming under the heat, which happens quickly when you heat metal up. So the kind that I use is also from Rio Grande. It's called Mighty Flux, and I get it in a great big bottle like this because you go through it pretty quickly. It is boric acid mixed with alcohol, and I think most fluxes are boric acid mixed with alcohol, just in different proportions, maybe with some other additives. This one works great, and it's reasonable in price, and from what I understand, boric acid is not particularly toxic, so I haven't found that I needed to be too cautious about using this stuff. It does get sticky when it dries and tends to be gum up your tools and things like that, so it's good to clean it off periodically when it starts to gum up things. So when you're polishing silver, you use various polishing compounds of different grits, and the thing you have to worry about polishing compounds is the silica particulate that's in it at varying sizes. When you're polishing, it tends to get airborne, and silica is bad for your lungs. It can cause silicosis and some other lung diseases. So it's a good idea to be super careful when you're polishing by wearing a good respirator or a solid ventilator mask that keeps dust out. It can ruin your lungs pretty seriously, so you want to always take care with your lungs. The kind that I use, the two that I use generally, are White Diamond, which is the one over here, and then Zam, which is a finer polishing compound that I use for the final polish. Many people take it even a step further and use what's called Red Rouge, which is a super fine polish. I find that tends to get it so shiny that it won't maintain that polish over a long period of time. So people, when they buy it, they tend to be disappointed after a couple of weeks when it's not quite as shiny as it used to be. So I could spend a lot of time talking about the safety of various hand tools and how to use them correctly. However, the biggest thing with using hand tools is to use good judgment and to pay attention to what's going on. For instance, The worst way that I've ever hurt myself when I was silversmithing was surprisingly with this, which is just a very simple jeweler's saw. It's not fancy. It has a very small blade with tiny teeth on it. I was cutting through this piece of silver with it, like a piece of sheet like this. I wasn't holding it like this, but it was on a bench pin, and I was going through it like this, and when I finally got through the silver, I was going so vigorously that on the downward sweep, it cut right into my finger beyond the metal there, all the way to the bone in just one stroke. So it's surprisingly how sharp some of these things can be if you're putting a little force on them. So you have to be a little bit careful about stuff like that. Then, of course, after that, I had to clean up all of the blood around my shop so that my students didn't think that there was a crime scene. Some other things that I do talk about as far as tools. For the beginners, I usually have them use these propane torches that are designed for plumbing. They produce plenty of heat for what we're doing in the beginning class, and they work well, and they're cheap, and it's an cheap way to get into the hobby. I don't generally burn myself with the flame on these things. What I usually do is I forget the tip is hot, and I'll end up leaning across to grab something off the table, and I'll lay my arm against the tip like this and get myself. So you have to be aware of a lot of things stay hot after you've been using them for quite a while, including this pad here, which is what my primary soldering surface usually is one of these kind of things. They'll stay hot for quite a while, and they don't look very hot. So you have to be a little careful about that. In addition to that, one of the things you always need to remember is when you're using fire, you want to have a fire extinguisher around. I have one on the wall behind me over there, or in front of me actually. And the other thing is you need to be situationally aware. So if you can see, many people use strikers to light their torches. I use a lighter. And so what I'll see people do a lot of times in class is they'll light their torch, and they'll set their lighter right next to their pad and start going to town on soldering something. And at that point, I'm freaking out and trying to get them to stop doing that as quickly as possible, because they're not paying attention to what's around their pad, and they're going to ignite something. And a lighter would be a bad thing to have ignite. I'm notorious for catching paper towels on fire myself, and luckily if you use a little flux you can just spray it right out if you start a fire. So, but you know, periodically look up from what you're doing to make sure you haven't lit something on fire. That's one of those things you should just learn after a while. Other things you need to worry about are the power tools, and the power tools that I worry about the most are the Dremel or the Fordham tool, which is a rotary power tool. This is my Dremel. Many people say that a Fordham tool is the best rotary tool because they have a big motor on them and they don't bog down. I found that a plug-in Dremel is just as good. It doesn't have quite as much power as a Fordham. So generally, if you're trying to get like a good polish with a Dremel, you can't really do that. With a Fordham, you tend to be able to because the motor is so much more powerful. However, price-wise, this is probably about a quarter or maybe an eighth as expensive as a nice Fordham tool. So you could use these for years and wear them out and never reach the price of a single Fordham tool. The thing that's scary about them is they can put all sorts of different bits in here. And like this one that's in here right now is very abrasive, and if you lay it on your finger or on your skin too long, it'll cut right in. Some of the other bits have actual blades on them, and you have to worry about when you're trying to do precise work where you're cutting something with a blade on this thing. It'll tend to jump around because it's got those individual blades that are spinning, and it'll chatter around, and sometimes it'll chatter off and get your finger. So you have to be a little careful with that kind of stuff. The other thing that scares me is people a lot of times are working on the inside of a ring like this, and they'll lose a hold of it, and while this thing is spinning, this will just rattle around this really fast and make a lot of noise. And while it's not terribly dangerous, it does startle you and make you panic for a minute there when it happens. So generally just turn off the Dremel and take it off and you're fine. Okay, final thing, the power tool that I care to talk about that is a little bit scary for people and can be a little dangerous is the polishing wheel. This is my polishing machine. It spins this way and it spins pretty rapidly. It's got a 3/4 horsepower motor on it, and so it's pretty powerful. You apply the polishing compounds to the wheel by just spinning it and touching it to it. And the thing you need to, things you need to remember about using this: always wear safety glasses when you're doing it. I use a respirator mask. This particular one's an N95 with a vent, and that keeps my lungs relatively safe. Polishing is messy and does spew a lot of dust in the air. The good thing about these nicer polishing machines is they have a fan in the back that sucks a lot of that dust through a filter, so it'll pick up a lot of it, but not all of it. The other thing you have to worry about when you're using these is loose clothing, loose jewelry, long hair that's not pulled back. You don't want to get caught tangled around this thing. That's a terrible thing to think about. It will draw you right into there, and so you got to be very careful when you're using these things. The other thing is, when you're polishing stuff, you're usually holding it like this, and it has a tendency to get grabbed by the wheel and thrown into the machine. The good thing is it usually lands in the tray here, and you can just turn the machine off and pull it out. But you don't want to reach back there when the machine is going, because personally I've lost some skin on my arm from doing that, because it'll take the skin right off your arm if you're not careful. The other thing is, you need to be careful when you're polishing things that have dangly stuff on them. One of the people I had in class years ago was doing an interlocking 3-ring bracelet, and he failed to heed my advice to keep things really contained in his hands that he wasn't polishing on. And so he was polishing one of the rings, and the other rings were swinging back and forth behind his hand here. And somehow one swung up here and caught on this spindle here and wrapped itself immediately around there and turned the whole thing into kind of a knot. He's lucky that his finger wasn't in there, because it probably would have pinched the end of his finger off as fast and as powerfully as that happened. So you have to be real cautious around this. Treat it with respect, and you'll get used to using it, and then it's not quite so intimidating anymore. Finally, just a couple of things. The gases we use as fuel to do this hobby, propane or acetylene, and some people use some different kinds of gases other than that, can be dangerous if they're mixed with air in the right proportions. So it's important that you monitor that your torches are all turned off when you're done, and that if you have an acetylene torch, that you burn the gases out of the hose to prevent any kind of leakage later on that could cause an explosion. So just be cautious about that kind of stuff, and take care, and remember to always check your torches when you're done with whatever you're doing, and you should be just fine. So finally, if you found this video informative, and if you'd like to help out a silversmith who likes to share his ideas and craft with other people, consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. I'd appreciate it. Also consider sharing this video with others who might find it interesting. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.